my aunt had a near-death experience back in 1996. She and a friend had gone out to the bar one Friday night, determined to each find a guy to bring home. They were both single and daring at the time, and wanted to try something adventurous. Since this was the 90s, they didn't have cell phones so they could text each other. Instead, they both came up with visual cues to look out for. If they removed their earrings, that meant they had found a guy they liked, and if they held their hand to the back of their neck in a casual manner, that meant come and save me. Before it was common to have conversations with one eye on your phone, this was how people got themselves out of awkward situations. My aunt told me how she mingled with the crowd for a bit and let a few guys buy her some drinks before zeroing in on one who was eyeballing her from across the bar. He gave her a wink but didn't come over to buy her a drink. She was intrigued by his interest, so she crossed the bar and went over to him. She told me he had a biker jacket on with a gold watch that had this leather band. She remembered that detail because her boss wore the exact same type. She used that to break the ice of conversation. They danced for a few minutes, and upon heading back to the bar, she removed her earrings, deciding this was the guy she wanted to spend the night with. He said his name was Harrison. They got a table in the corner, and she let him buy her a drink. After a while, though, she lost track of time and began to feel very sluggish and nauseous. She decided that she had overdone it with the cocktails. She glanced around the bar but couldn't find her friend anywhere. Feeling shaky on her legs, she excused herself to the restroom, hoping that's where her friend was, but no such luck. She left the bathroom and headed straight for the door, suddenly not feeling so up to having company over anymore. She began to hail a cab when Harrison came out of the bar behind her and asked her if she needed a ride home. She had hoped to just slip away, afraid she might be sick and make a fool of herself, but she decided to risk it for the sake of getting a ride home and possibly getting his phone number. On the route home, she started feeling slightly better and started getting flirty with him when they parked in her driveway. She invited him inside. They went in through the front door, and my aunt dropped her keys on the stairs on the way to the living room. They made out on the couch for a few minutes, but suddenly my aunt felt sick to her stomach. She apologized and told him he had to go. He was very understanding, she said, and hoped she would feel better soon. They made plans to meet the next Friday night at the same bar. Harrison let himself out, and my aunt locked the door behind him, feeling a bit disappointed and gross. She went to bed, but she couldn't fall asleep. Her head just wouldn't stop spinning. Just past midnight, she began to hear some movement from downstairs. She sat up in bed and listened closely. She knew both her parents were still out of state. She had spoken to them on the landline before she left that night. No one else had the key to her house either, so for a few moments she sat there frozen, uncertain if what she was hearing was real. She began to hear these noises again. Not soft noises like someone trying to be stealthy, mind you. It sounded more like someone rummaging and rampaging around downstairs. My aunt locked her bedroom door and pressed her ear to the ground. She could hear down below the cabinets being opened and shut rapidly. She grabbed the phone in her room and called the police, then hid in her closet. In retrospect, she laughed at the absurdity of her situation, because her phone was not wireless, so anyone breaking into that room would immediately see the cord leading right to her. When the operator came on, my aunt started talking a mile a minute, saying she was sure there was someone in her house. The operator kept her on the line, and the next 15 minutes felt like 6 hours. During a brief pause in the conversation, my aunt heard the footsteps coming up the stairs, followed by doors squeaking, as whoever this was peered in each room one by one. She went dead silent as she heard the person pause outside her bedroom door. She didn't even notice the sirens outside until they were in her driveway. The following few minutes were a complete nightmare. She wondered why the cops weren't making entry into the home. The operator informed her that the police were just outside but couldn't find any indication of a break-in. In a panic, she instructed them to break down the door. Almost immediately, there was a commotion on the stairs. My aunt heard several voices screaming for someone to get down on the ground. After another moment, my aunt crawled out of the closet and went beside the bedroom door. She waited until an officer knocked and told her it was okay to come out. My aunt wrapped herself in a long coat and followed the officer down the stairs and outside the front door. Before she reached it, she glanced over into the living room and saw the plastic shower curtain from her downstairs bathroom spread out across the floor. Her father's open toolbox was laying on the ground next to it, as well as a bunch of knives from the kitchen. She started hyperventilating, and they had to call an ambulance for her. After she recovered, the police let her look at the suspect. Through the squad car's tinted windows, she recognized Harrison immediately. It turned out that when he left earlier, he'd grabbed her keys off the stairs and come back later. He let himself right in. The paramedics reported finding drugs in her system and concluded he had drugged her at the bar. He had used the wrong amount, though, because it hadn't knocked her out as quickly or as deeply as he had intended. Harrison, of course, turned out to be a fake name. What was the most strange thing about him, according to the police, was that he had no criminal record at all. He later died in prison from leukemia. Today, my aunt shares the story willingly every time she's asked about it. There was even a running joke in our family not to buy her plastic shower curtains. Let me just start off by saying that if it wasn't for all these scary stories royally freaking us all out, I don't think my children and I would still be here today. A few weeks ago on a Saturday morning, my kids and I were all sitting around the breakfast table, enjoying some pancakes. My husband was doing as usual, rushing around and getting ready for work because he had overslept yet again. As we were saying our goodbyes, I reminded him that the kids and I were going to the local splash pad for the afternoon. I never used to lock the doors to the backyard because it was fenced in with a locked gate, so I didn't really see the need to. For some reason, though, today I locked it out of paranoia. Perhaps because I'd gotten kind of spooked from listening to scary stories the night before, even though a break-in was highly unlikely in this area. I suddenly didn't feel like tempting fate, though, and challenging a burglar to enter. I got to doing chores around the house when I noticed it was raining outside. Figuring the splash pad was no longer an option, I left the room and tried to find an activity that would keep the kids all occupied. We ended up building a couch fort. After a short while, I got up and returned to the laundry room to check the machine. As I was preparing the new load, though, I noticed our back gate was suddenly wide open. I thought that was very strange. Even with the harsh winds, the lock should have held. The thought had barely finished forming in my head when my daughter came rushing in to find me. "Mommy, there's a man at the window. He waved at me." Feeling confident that my daughter's imaginative mind was playing tricks on her, I followed her back into the living room. My heart skipped a beat when on the other side of the window, I could see a very dirty man wearing a black tattered leather jacket. He had long oily hair, and he wasn't even trying to be discreet at all. He was just staring directly into her house. He had his eyes fixated on my son in particular, who was sitting in the middle of the living room. "Hey, what are you doing? Get the hell out of my garden!" I shouted. He gave me the biggest, most malicious smile. In his right hand, he lifted a very large and bloody knife. Panic kicked in. I grabbed my son and daughter as calmly as I could and rushed them upstairs. I told them we were going to play a game of hide and seek, and that they needed to hide in the wardrobe and stay quiet. My daughter had enough sense to know that we were hiding from the man outside, but I assured them that the man was a friend and they didn't have to worry. I walked back downstairs and opened a closet door. I grabbed a baseball bat and held it over my head, ready to swing at anything that moved. I went back to the living room window, where the man had been standing before. He was gone already, but he'd left behind a bloody handprint on the glass. I grabbed my phone and called the police. After I explained the situation, they told me they would have an officer over as soon as possible. The officer arrived in only a matter of minutes. I showed him the bloody handprint. He went outside to investigate, and while he was doing that, I grabbed my kids from my bedroom. I sat them down and allowed them to watch cartoons while I spoke with the officer. He informed me that there were bloody fingerprints all over my back door handle. The guy had been trying to get in. The next few hours were a real blur. The officer called somebody out to take samples of the blood. They took my statement, and my husband took the rest of the day off to be with us. The officer contacted me and said they had arrested the man who was in the back garden. Apparently, the man had done the exact same thing to another family just days after it happened to mine. The blood on the window was his own, according to the police. This guy had been recently released from a mental institution, I guess, and had not been taking his medication. God knows what he would have done to us if he'd managed to get in. Maybe his intention was only to scare us, but maybe it was something far worse. I truly believe scary stories saved me and my children that day. If it wasn't for my paranoia due to watching them, I think the outcome might have been completely different. So this happened at Christmas a couple of years ago, when I was spending the holidays with my parents and little brother, along with my cousins, aunts, and uncles. We live in a suburb in Ontario, but we were venturing out into the woods for Christmas, an idea my parents had had for quite a while. They always loved the idea of being out in a hunting cabin during Christmas, with all of our family around. I'm a 22-year-old female, but at the time I was just turning 18. My little brother Tom was 11. We were really close, and we do everything together. We also had our dog, a German Shepherd named Trigger. He's a real softie, but he can be really overprotective, especially of my brother Tom. Anyway, we left our house on Christmas Eve around 2 p.m. and climbed into our dad's truck, filled with all of our stuff and presents for his extended family. Tom and I were honestly really excited, winding each other up. My parents were having some conversations as we moved along the road. We arrived at the village near the cabins we were staying in and caught up with my dad's sister Billy, along with her husband and 3 kids. Billy was a bit unsure of where to go from the village to actually get to the place we were staying. My dad helped her out by running down the various directions. We soon got back on our way and arrived at the cabins at around 4 p.m. It was a big cluster of them, sort of spaced out in the woods a bit. Each family had their own cabin, and it was one where everyone could meet up. It had a pool table, a swimming pool, and all sorts of other stuff. It was the kind of place where everyone could just chill together and enjoy each other's company. Anyway, the weather was already really cold when we arrived, and the snow was falling all around us. As me and my brother unpacked our things into the cabin and settled in for the night, my dad started a fire while my mom made us dinner. It was pretty great, honestly. The Christmas decorations were already up. We played a few board games with everyone, and as it got darker, my dad, Tom, and I decided before going on the trip that we would all go hunting sometime, so we planned out a thing to do the next day. I had been a few times before, but it was Tom's first time. He was only there to watch us. He was still too young to be shooting himself. It reached about 10 p.m., and my brother and I were getting a bit tired. We decided to head off to bed. My dad kept all the rifles in a bag that was placed underneath the bed I was sleeping in. He would usually keep them in a locked box, but he thought there was no point this time since we were going hunting the next morning anyway. Tom and I were sharing a room at the end of the cabin, facing a flowing river. The view was quite beautiful. Tom and I fell asleep with our dog Trigger laying at the bottom of Tom's bed. Now, this is when things really began to get creepy. It was about 3 a.m. or so when I awoke to Trigger growling. I didn't find this very unusual because my dad suffers from insomnia. Sometimes when he can't sleep, he'll get up and move to the living room and watch some TV or jog around a bit. Trigger was extremely overprotective and growled at basically any noise he could hear. I noticed there was no light coming from under my door though. My dad would never just sit in the dark. I whispered to Trigger, telling him to be quiet as Tom was sleeping, but his growl soon turned into barking, which woke Tom up right away. He asked me what was going on, but I said Trigger must have heard some deer or something outside. After all, we were in the middle of the woods, so what else could it be? Suddenly, our bedroom door swung open, and the light switch was turned on. My eyes stung as I tried to focus on whoever was at the door. It was my dad. "Hey, were you two laughing just now?" he asked, as he turned over to look at Tom, his eyes wide and his face pale. "No," I replied, as he moved over towards our curtains. He pulled them back and looked out into the pitch-black wilderness. "What are you looking at?" Tom asked as our dad closed the curtains again. "Nothing, just go back to sleep." I was kind of creeped out that my dad didn't say anything about what he was doing, but we turned our lights off and tried to go back to bed. Of course, that was much easier said than done. I couldn't do so. I was wide awake for the rest of the night, flinching at pretty much every noise I heard. It was about 4:30 a.m. when I finally drifted off to sleep. It must have only been moments later, though, when I heard a strange crunching noise coming from outside our window. I was sure it was not an animal. It sounded like footsteps instead. There was this overwhelming feeling of fear. I pulled the covers over my face, sweat beginning to cover my forehead. I then heard a faint tapping on our window, which lasted a good few minutes. I was so petrified I couldn't move at all. Trigger was awake by this point, and I saw his face turn towards the window, his ears pointed and listening intently. The tapping began again, a bit louder this time. That caused Trigger to bare his teeth. What happened next was the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me. "Are you in there, little guy?" This deep and husky voice whispered as a horrible shiver went down my spine. "Why don't you come over here and play with me?" Initially, I was filled with rage. The thought that this was bound to be one of my cousins playing a stupid prank on us. I leaned forward and peeked through the gap in the curtain, ready to give them hell for scaring the shit out of us. But standing there was not any of our cousins. It was some creepy old man I'd never seen before. He looked to be around 60. His hair was matted, and his clothing looked dirty and ancient. He was stroking the window with his hands, breathing on it as he spoke. I went into protective mode. I didn't know what else to do. I grabbed my dad's hunting rifle from under my bed and pulled the curtain back. "Get the hell out of here, or I'll shoot you!" I felt adrenaline rushing through me as the creepy man's eyes widened. The most terrifying smile appeared across his face. Trigger then began barking louder than I'd ever heard him bark before. My parents obviously heard all this commotion. They came running into the room, turning the light on. My mom screamed as she saw the old man through the window. Trigger continued barking furiously. My dad yelled at the man, telling him the police were on their way. The man simply turned around and walked back into the woods. Tom was petrified, but I was angry. How could some sicko do this? I was extremely glad I had that rifle with me. The cops caught the guy just a few minutes later and arrested him promptly. We found out after a couple of days that the man was homeless and had been living in the woods. He was apparently suffering from a lot of mental issues. It scares me to think what would have happened to my brother if I wasn't there. We spent the remainder of Christmas Day at the cabin, but we stayed in our Aunt Billy's cabin overnight. There was no way we were sleeping in our own after what just happened. We went home the first thing next morning and never looked back. My dad told me the other day that he knew someone was creeping around when he heard the sound of someone laughing and singing outside the cabin before checking up on us. He intentionally left the rifle under my bed just in case I had to use it in self-defense. He did that because he didn't want to scare any of us. He called the cops after he heard the guy laughing outside his bedroom window. He knew it would take them a while to reach the cabin. Safe to say, that was the scariest moment of my life. This occurred many years ago now, but it will forever stay with me and changed my views on allowing kids to ever have their own separate phone line. It was a few weeks after Christmas, and my parents had got me my own personal phone. That was cool back then, before cell phones had really gotten big. I had given my friends the number, because who wouldn't, right? Anyway, it was around 3 a.m. I had been sleeping when my phone suddenly began to ring. I thought, who could be calling me this early when we all have to be up for school the next morning? I answered, expecting to hear one of my friends, but instead all I heard was heavy breathing on the other end. I laughed it off as someone messing with me initially. I hung up and tried returning to sleep. My phone began to ring soon after though. This time I answered and asked who this was. Again, I heard nothing but breathing. At this point, I was getting quite irritated. I told them to stop calling me. I hung up and laid down again for about 30 minutes. My phone began to ring for a third time that morning. I was so mad that I answered it and yelled out, "This isn't funny. I'm trying to sleep. I have school in the morning, so stop calling me." This time there was an actual reply though. It was a man's voice. "I can see you. You're very pretty. Why don't you come out and play in the snow with me?" I ran to my parents' room and woke up my mom, telling her what just happened. She in turn woke up my dad and made me tell him what happened as well. My dad went into my room and checked the windows and everything, making sure all the locks were secured. He proceeded to tell me that someone must be playing a sick joke on me and that everything would be fine. He told me to just unplug my phone from the outlet. Finally, I managed to go back to sleep until my mom woke me up for school. I got up and started getting ready. I opened my blinds to my window that overlooked the backyard when I noticed on this very frosty morning that there were handprints all over my window. I freaked out and yelled for my parents. The police came out to take a report and look at the evidence. They went into the backyard, and sure enough, there were a set of footprints that led right up to my window in the snow. They had gone from the front of my house to my window, then to the back door, then back to the front door. The police came to the conclusion that the man must have been trying to get inside all night. In college, I was stupid. Yeah, there's a phrase you've probably heard a million times over. But I wasn't just the, "Oh, I'm skipping class today and deliberately shirking homework for no other reason than to party" kind of stupid. I made decisions that actively could have endangered my life for the sake of being cool, especially in my freshman and sophomore years. I did eventually get it straight by my senior year, but I digress. I probably shouldn't even be here to tell some of these stories. However, there was one decision I made that I can't even just call stupid. It was so life-threatening, so idiotic, so no common sense based that I probably should have just called it quits the moment I made it. Honestly, I still don't know how I got out of it as well as I did. Anyway, here's the lead up to the event. My a cappella group, yes, I was the freshman in an a cappella group wanting to be like the girls in Pitch Perfect, had organized a celebratory dinner at a local pub known as The Roost. It seemed really sketchy at first. It was located in the basement of an apartment building, but once you opened the door to the pub itself, it instantly became a legitimate establishment. We had a really fun night, sharing a huge table of appetizers and a rum bucket each. They were offering a $5 special, you see. We were telling each other stories and even occasionally bursting into song. The more I drank, the more blurry the night became. Faces started swimming together, and I really didn't want the night to end. The alcohol was definitely lowering my inhibitions considerably, but like any alcohol drinker, I thought I was still in control. At the end of the night, most of my group split off to go home. That meant I was left all alone to walk to my apartment all the way across town. Now, I should say that one of my friends in the group offered to go home with me, but I refused because I thought it was too far for them, and I thought I would be fine. In hindsight, I think I should have taken their offer. It was around 10 p.m. when I started this lonely journey home. I could see my breath in the night's air. All the alcohol in my system was making me feel quite warm, though. I remember feeling grateful for it as I meandered my way down the sidewalk, stumbling here and there. Thankfully, the route to my apartment was pretty well lit and populated, so I didn't think I had much to worry about. At worst, I'd trip and smash my nose in, which due to how drunk I was a real possibility. I was just settling into daydreaming when a car pulled up right beside me. I got startled and stepped back, almost teetering over. From what I remember, a guy my age leaned out the driver's side window. "Hey there, you want to have some fun? My buddies and I were going to play some games at my friend's house." This would be the moment for everyone to shout, "No, don't go in there!" at the top of their lungs during a horror movie. But I was so drunk there were no alarm bells at all. No voice in my head shouting at me not to do it or calling me an idiot. So, with a huge grin, I said, "Hell yeah!" Like I said, I wanted the fun to continue, and this guy was pretty cute. I got into the car. I sat shotgun, and then I noticed another 3 guys sat in the back. The driver, who said his name was Charlie, kept up conversation with me about nothing and everything at the same time. My favorite games, movies, alcohol. He said he wanted to have something everyone would like at their little party. The way he smiled at me made me blush, and despite the unusual way we were meeting, my adult brain told me, fuck it. If tonight goes well, I want to see this guy again. Of course, on the way there, I started to sober up a little. I realized that this Charlie guy had never told me which friend was supposedly hosting, nor where we would actually be going for that matter. The road seemed to stretch endlessly for miles, and I began to shiver. Charlie asked me if I was cold, and motioned to turn the heat up. I said thanks and then asked him where we were all going. "We're going to my friend's place. Relax," he said, laughing. "Yeah, but where is your friend's place?" I pressed on. "Oh, it's not far, just a few more minutes. Hey, so you said you did a cappella, right?" Now I was more quickly beginning to sober up. I was in a car with 4 guys I didn't know. I didn't know where we were or where we were even going. I knew I was pretty fucked now. "Okay, so I'm gonna need some answers or I need to go home." I tried sounding as stern as possible, but my voice came out dry and weak. I cleared my throat and tried a different approach when they didn't respond. "Can we at least stop for some water? Is there a gas station nearby or something?" "Why, you gonna bail on us or something?" One of his friends piped up. I only noticed just now that they were looking at me really intensely, like they were just waiting for something to happen. Something was very wrong here, and I'd waltzed right into it. My rum bucket was threatening to make a reappearance. I was thinking it wouldn't be that bad if I just let it all loose on them. That's when Charlie piped up again. "We're here." The here he was referring to was a 1-story house that looked like it could have been on an average episode of Hoarders, or perhaps even abandoned completely, if it weren't for the light shining out through the windows. trash and bottles littered the ground. I opened the door before the car even stopped and launched myself to the ground. The rocks scraped me as I rolled on it. Charlie shouted something, but I couldn't hear him. The car came to a screeching stop. I scrambled to my feet and took off running. I shook the gravel out of my hair as I tore down the street and ran off into the woods. I had no idea where I was, or even where I was going. I only knew what I was running away from. I could hear footsteps and shouting chasing after me, but I knew I couldn't look back. As I was running, various branches slapped me across the face. I was hoping for something, anything familiar, that wasn't Charlie and these other guys. Eventually, I broke through the tree line, and on the other side I saw a house. The porch light was on, and I could see someone was inside watching TV through one of the windows. Charlie's shouts were long gone by this point, but I didn't want to take the chance that he'd given up on doing whatever he was trying to do. I ran up and knocked on the door. No one came to answer at first, and I mean, who could blame them really? I kept on knocking though, this time yelling out, "Hey, I need help, please!" Finally, a young couple answered. A dog barked from inside the house, and I breathed a sigh of relief. They looked obviously startled to see me there, dirt-caked and out of breath. They asked me if there was something I needed. I'm not religious, but I was thanking every god in that moment. I explained as quickly as I could that I had been picked up by some guys in a car, and things had started getting really sketchy. I had to call someone right now. They quickly ushered me inside and introduced me to their hound dog, so he'd stop barking. They got me a phone and a hot drink as well. These two were beyond nice to a strange girl coming to their house in the middle of the night. I'll forever look back on them and wish they're doing okay. Anyway, I called one of my a cappella friends who was still fit to drive. She became the voice of reason I'd been looking for this entire time. She really chewed me out for my stupid decisions. She still came out to get me though, and I promised her I'd never do such fucking stupid shit again. Her words, not mine. This is a chronicle of my experiences with a man who preached the gospel on my college campus. His name was Ed. He was a tall, graying man that looked like he had been weighed down by life. He seemed to come alive, though, when he came onto campus by the library to yell out the word of God to passerbys. As a Christian myself, though, this was not any version of the Bible I'd ever heard. Apparently, Ed believed that God would bring down his wrath on all those who pursued anything other than him in their life. Namely, academia, marriage, and love. Other things that would make you happy, to name a few. He would even go as far as to harass students walking by, especially if they dressed alternatively or behaved in any way that didn't suit him. At the same time, he would tell people to be fruitful and multiply as well. One of the creepier things out of his mouth was directed to my friend and his girlfriend, where he told him to take care of that flower as they were passing by. Really made my skin crawl when I heard that later. You can probably guess what he meant, and I don't care to spell it out. But needless to say, something had to be done about this guy before things potentially escalated. I had several run-ins with Ed myself in the past, where he'd forcefully hand me a pamphlet that explained everyone was going to hell. I didn't realize just how bad it would eventually get though, until one night. Me and my roommate at the time were walking back from a late dinner. We walked across the side of some dorm buildings that didn't have the best lighting. We were just talking about how our weeks were going. Inevitably, the conversation turned to Ed, and how many more crazy run-ins people we knew had with him that week. It also turned into a bit of making fun of him, which I'm not proud to admit. If someone harasses people on the regular, though, I think it's fair game. Anyway, my friend had just gotten around to loudly saying what a religious freak he was. I didn't even take offense to that, by the way, when suddenly a car's headlights turned on to beam right at us. We froze as the car rumbled to life. Because of the high beams, we couldn't see the driver, but we had the feeling they were watching us, as if daring us to make more comments. We didn't know at the time what Ed drove on his days off from saying we were all going to hell for going to college, but it was too coincidental that this car tried to freak us out right after we made rude comments about him. Maybe we were just freaking ourselves out, but we didn't stop to consider it. We ran down a shortcut back to our dorm room as the car trailed behind us. We ran up the stairs and frantically tried to talk ourselves into the idea that there was no way it could be Ed. That wasn't his usual style of creeping people out. But since we couldn't disprove it, we were only left with the idea that Ed was starting to escalate into silent terror instead of just creepy comments. Long story short, we slept with the light on that night and avoided Ed a lot more thoroughly from then on. Growing up, I wasn't really the house party type. I usually spent school nights inside reading a book or with a small group of playing cards on the living room floor. That suited me just fine, really. I had a lot of social anxiety, and the idea of people I didn't know all pressing in on me together didn't really sit well. I tended to avoid these sorts of things. That all changed though when a house party was essentially sprung on me by a friend of my boyfriend's. He and her had grown up together, essentially brother and sister, so when she invited the two of us over for what she said would be a small get-together, my boyfriend and I trusted her completely. All was well when we first got there. It was just the three of us, and we watched a movie and hung out with our cats. But as the night went on, more and more people started showing up. I didn't really mind it at first because we had our own little corner, but eventually the house seemed to fill up with so many people that we were forced to move away from the couch. Someone ended up bringing alcohol, and soon the entire home was a tightly packed, full-on house party, complete with the smell of booze and drunk people getting into your personal space left and right. My boyfriend asked his friend what the hell was going on. She just shrugged and said we needed to get out of our shells a bit, and it was fine. Instead of wanting to come out of my shell, though, I wanted to crawl out of my skin instead. Everything was too bright, too hot, too close all at once. I felt like I wasn't getting any air. I had to get out of there, at least outside, to calm down. I turned and reached for my boyfriend's hand, but his friend had already dragged him away to mingle with some people playing cards. I was alone and being shoved around by people I didn't even know. Sweat was starting to get to me, choking me even more. I squeezed and shoved my way through the crowd, searching for my boyfriend or any familiar faces. Somebody thrust a drink into my hands. It looked dark and smelled definitely strong, so there was no way I was going to drink this. When a break opened up in the crowd, I dove for it almost in a daze. I got to the sink and dumped out the glass, standing there and watching that dark brown booze swirl down the drain. I felt a little better being slightly away from the crowd, but the air was still pretty stifling. I needed some fresh air, so I stuck to the walls and eased my way to the front door. I quietly slipped out. The porch was quiet. The lights outside provided a soothing glow. I sat down on the steps with my head buzzing. I wondered how my boyfriend was doing in there. He was a bit introverted like me, but he carried himself better until he reached his limit. I rubbed my temples. My nerves were slowly calming down, and I felt a bit less suffocated than I did before. I still thought it was a good idea to grab my boyfriend and go, as this wasn't what we had signed up for. I decided to wait for him to come find me instead, though. I wasn't ready to go back inside to that choking mass just yet. My peace was shattered when someone stormed out onto the porch behind me. I thought it was my boyfriend blowing off steam, but suddenly a voice I didn't recognize growled out, "Why the fuck didn't you drink it?" I swallowed, feeling a lump in my throat. "What? Why the fuck didn't you drink the beer I gave you?" the guy said. He suddenly grabbed my shoulder and spun me around. I backed out of his grip and down the steps, putting as much distance between us as I could. He was an average-looking guy wearing a gray hoodie, and his eyes were kind of sunken in. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I stammered. Then I remembered, though, the beer I'd poured down the sink. That must have been what he was talking about. But why was he so upset I didn't drink it? "Hey, I'm sorry if I wasted the beer. Did you buy it? I can give you the money if you want." "Shut up!" he exploded. He was pacing on the porch now. "I gave you that beer. You should have been nice and drank it." I was getting really creeped out now. The lump in my throat grew larger, and with the anxiety already buzzing, I wanted to cry. I wanted my boyfriend. I wanted to go. I didn't even want to be here tonight. "Look," I started to say. The guy stormed back inside, but not before calling me a bitch and many other insulting things. I stood there alone for a minute, and by the time a new song started up inside, tears started to fall. My boyfriend and his friend came to check on me a few minutes later. They said there was a guy who'd been acting weird all night, handing people random solo cups and getting pissed off if they didn't take them. When I told them the same guy had handed me one and followed me outside when I'd poured it down the drain, my normally quiet boyfriend lost it. He yelled at his friend for inviting us under false pretenses and for lying to us about it being a house party. The friend tried to defend herself by saying she didn't know what was going to happen, and that was sort of true. But my boyfriend retorted, saying she still should have let us know what she'd been planning so we could be smart about it. She said she'd handle it and went back inside, presumably to kick the guy out for acting crazy. I never got to see the aftermath, though. My boyfriend and I decided to go. We got in the car and drove away. He apologized on the way back for leaving me alone, and I said it was okay. Honestly, I would have been fine if that weird guy hadn't come out after me. I don't know exactly what that guy had planned for anyone who drank the mysterious beer he handed out, but it couldn't have been good. Maybe he was a guy who just didn't like to have his ego bruised when no one appreciated his gesture, but from the way he came out after me, I'm not quite so sure.